Hello, everyone. Today, I would like to take a few minutes and talk about one of my favorite reading experiences that I've had so far this year, and that has been going through the Solomon Kane short stories by Robert E. Howard. Let's back up here a little bit. Robert E. Howard, as most of you probably know, is a pulp writer, is one of the sort of founding fathers of what we understand as fantasy today. Famously wrote the Conan the Barbarian character in his short stories, but also Solomon Kane, King Cole, Bran McMorn, and many other characters. He wrote quite a bit in the 30 years that he was alive. And he's known as an early pulp author. But I want to specifically talk about why I enjoyed these Solomon Kane stories so much, my experience with them, with pulp in general, and why I think these stories are special. So to back up, I did not grow up reading Robert E. Howard, but I did read Edgar Rice Burroughs, who wrote the John Carter books and the Tarzan books. And at the time, when I was reading Burroughs, I was also reading Charles Dickens and George MacDonald and others, what we would consider to be more like classical literature authors. And I knew that there's a difference between, the more highbrow, as it's perceived, classical literature and pulp, and yet I still loved Burroughs as an author. And for the longest time, in terms of what is considered to be pulp authors, Burroughs probably would have been my favorite. Howard certainly is giving him a run for his money, though, more today. But I really loved Burroughs' writing. I really loved that pulp style. They're fun, they're entertaining, and yet at the same time, I've been going back recently and rereading some of the John Carter books. Burroughs is also interested in asking some serious questions and doing complicated things in those stories, delving into societal problems, sociological issues, issues of colonization and even exploitation, systems of power, religion, things like that in the pulpy John Carter books. So I've always known that there's something there, even though they're pulpy, fun books. Now, you can't read fantasy for too long without reading an author who's been heavily influenced by Robert E. Howard. Most big fantasy authors have been influenced by him in one way or another, either writing in his shadow or trying to specifically pivot away from him. Some of the most famous fantasy authors out there, from Robert Jordan, George R.R. Martin, Joe Abercrombie, have all been influenced by Howard in one way or another. Last year, I made it my goal to read through all of the Conan the Barbarian short stories. I had read bits and pieces and had enjoyed what I'd read, but I wanted to be a completionist. I wanted to read all of them. And so Del Rey prints, you can see them behind me there, prints in the same edition as these Solomon Kane stories, the Conan stories, which Howard wrote much more about Conan than he did about Solomon Kane. And I really enjoyed those. I had a lot of fun with them. There's varying quality between some of the stories. Not all of them are home runs, but all of them are at least entertaining, and many of them are excellent. Some of my favorite short stories of all time are in those collections. This year, though, I've had the Solomon Kane collection for a while, and this year I said I want to get through those stories. Now, just a bit of personal background in terms of how I've been going through them. I didn't grow up in a family that did a lot of grilling or campfires a whole lot, but I decided I wanted to learn how to use a charcoal grill and be able to make burgers and hot dogs and kebabs and whatever else on a charcoal grill. So that's been one of my goals this summer. And when you're charcoal grilling, there's times where you have a few minutes where you're just letting the meat cook, you just let it be, and I didn't want to just park on my phone during that time, so I've been bringing out books of short stories and reading through those. And so the Solomon Kane stories have been kind of my go-to for the first part of this summer. And I have fallen head over heels in love with these stories. So for people who don't know, Solomon Kane is set roughly early 17th century, and Solomon Kane is a Puritan. And he's a Puritan who feels like he has been given a mission by God to go out and defend the defenseless, to bring justice to the wicked, to fight evil wherever he sees this. And oftentimes this comes in the form of fighting back pirates, bandits, marauders, people who are defrauding their neighbors, what have you. But much of the time, it involves facing down the enemies of hell themselves. or enemies who are from hell themselves, fighting demons, ghosts, monsters, vampires, all sorts of bad guys like that. And Kane is loosely connected in a lot of ways to the Hyborian stuff that Howard is writing about in those Conan stories. There's a very loose chronology there, but you've got Kull and then Conan and then Bran McMorn, and then many centuries later you would have these Solomon Kane stories. And so it's almost like the last remnants of this mythic Hyborian age of wizards and sorcerers and monsters, the last surviving elements from that time of myth and legend. Whatever has survived, Solomon Kane is looking to hunt down and destroy if they're forces of evil. Now, one of the issues that Howard ran into with a lot of his pulp writing, and Kane is one of his earliest pulp characters, is he found that he would write about a character for a while and then felt like he had squeezed all the juice that he could get out of a character and that there was just nothing else to do with them, and so he'd move on and write about another character. And this is what made Conan so successful as a character, is that he was very versatile in terms of he could be applied to all sorts of fantasy situations. In one story, he's a thief. In another story, he's a war leader. In another story, he's a king. In another, he's a slave. And so he can kind of work in whatever setting, whatever situation you want. And the benefit of that is we have a lot more Conan stories than we do for these other Hyborian characters. The downside of that is that the stories feel like they have much less of a through line to them than other stories of his. And that's one of the reasons why I like the Solomon Kane stories. One of them is that there feels like there is a consistency to the character throughout all of the stories. Kane is somewhat of a religious fanatic. He has a zeal to him. He has a fire in his soul. He thinks he's on a righteous quest, if you will. And so that element of it, I really like. So here is a passage specifically from the story The Moon of Skulls, which is one of my favorite of the Kane stories, where it's describing the worldview that Kane has. And here's what it says. He never sought to analyze his motives, and he never wavered once his mind was made up. Though he always acted on impulse, he firmly believed that all his actions were governed by cold and illogical reasoning. He was a man born out of his time, a strange blending of Puritan and Cavalier with a touch of the ancient philosopher and more than a touch of the pagan, though the last assertion would have shocked him unspeakably. An atavist in the days of blind chivalry he was, a knight-errant in the somber clothes of a fanatic. A hunger in his soul drove him on, an urge to right all wrongs, protect all weaker things, avenge all crimes against right and justice. Wayward and restless as the wind, he was consistent in only one respect. He was true to his ideals of justice and right. Such was Solomon Kane. And that, man, you want to talk about melodrama. And that's one of the reasons why I love pulp stories as much as I do, is because I have a very high tolerance for melodrama. Although, having said that, you read Shakespeare, you read Homer, there's plenty of melodrama to go around in those writings as well. So I like that aspect of Solomon Kane. Also, Kane's stories often are him traveling around the world. There's many of them that are set in Africa, with all of the things that you would get from an American writing about African adventures in the 1930s. But those stories are almost like a mixing of the Quartermain stories from H. Rider Haggard and Indiana Jones stories. Specifically, that last one that I was mentioning there almost feels like a prototype for Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom. And I love Indiana Jones. So all of these things are things that I really like. But I also like that he is combining this Puritan zeal, this religious zeal, with action-adventure. Kane believes that he is a knight on a mission from God. Now, whether he's correct or not is left up to the viewer, but also his beliefs get challenged by some of the things that he encounters. Kane famously has a character that is seen as is described as being an African witch doctor whose name is Nolanga, that Kane sees as a blood brother who helps him on several of his missions. Nolanga even gives him this magical staff that Kane carries and uses in some of his adventures. And there's some question as to what this staff is. Is it a piece of witchcraft that Kane is using? Is it an ancient artifact from the days of Atlantis? Is it maybe some biblical token of God's power? and it's left somewhat ambiguous, but the question being asked is interesting. The fact that Kane is having to confront his own assumptions about the nature of right and wrong, good and evil. Somebody in the manga that normally he would oppose and seek to destroy is now somebody that he's allied with. That's interesting. And Kane changes. His character develops over the course of the stories, which is not something that you get as much in the Conan stories, being whatever he needs to be for whichever adventure it is, and being told out of order as well. There's not a clear chronology in the same way that there is for the Solomon Kane stories. Some people don't like these as much also because it is some of Howard's early writing. Howard's writing isn't necessarily as smooth, isn't necessarily as clean, and they think that develops better in the Conan stories, and that's fine, but it doesn't bug me here. His craft may improve in the later stories. That's very much a valid argument, and yet the characterization of what he's doing here is so great. Also, like I said, some of the best of the sword and sorcery stories that Howard wrote are about Solomon Kane. Red Shadows is one of the best. The Moon of Skulls, which I was just talking about, is also great. I'm trying to remember exactly the name of this last one. Wings in the Night, which is maybe the best sword and sorcery story I've ever read, in which Kane is pushed absolutely to the breaking point. It's even questioned, does he go insane because of the horrific things that he suffers in it, the things that he has to endure? Or has he been crazy all the time because he's somewhat of a religious fanatic? And so all of that is just right up my alley and things that I've really enjoyed. And not to beat a dead horse about this or anything, but in the same way that the Indiana Jones movies have this extra bit of zing and pep because they're bringing in a supernatural religious element, I think the Solomon Kane stories have a similar advantage. The fact that Kane is driven by a theology, by a religious worldview, I think adds an extra amount of spice to these sword and sorcery adventures. So this is at the end of one of the short stories. I won't tell you which one, because we don't need to spoil it. But he's endured great difficulty. He's endured very hard trials. And here are some of his ending words in the story. "The light of God's morning enters even into dark and lonesome lands," said Solomon Kane somberly. "Evil rules in the wastelands of the earth, but even evil may come to an end. Dawn follows midnight, and even in this lost land the shadows shrink. Strange are thy ways, O God of my people, and who am I to question thy wisdom? My feet have fallen in evil ways, but thou hast brought me forth scatheless, and hast made me a scourge for the powers of evil. Over the souls of men spread the condor wings of colossal monsters, and all manner of evil things prey upon the heart and soul and body of man. Yet it may be, in some far day the shadows shall fade, and the prince of darkness shall be chained forever in his hell. Until then mankind can but stand up stoutly to the monsters in his own heart and without, and with the aid of God he may yet triumph." It's like, man, like, what rousing, great, melodramatic goodness. So, anyway, that's a bit about the stories that Howard has written. One of the interesting things is that with these sword and sorcery characters, every once in a while you'll get pastiche novels written about them. Conan famously has a bunch of pastiche novels where other people have come in and written stories about Conan that weren't written originally by Howard. I have it up there, but Robert Jordan famously wrote Conan pastiche novels. And for all the dozens and dozens of books written about Conan after the fact that Howard didn't write, there's only been one or two things, pastiches in terms of that have been written about Solomon Kane. But just this year, in 2026, a pastiche novel was written about Solomon Kane called Solomon Kane, Suffer the Witch by Sean Hamill, I believe is the author. And it's great. I encountered this literally randomly. I was looking for other editions of Solomon Kane books, and this popped up on my eBay search. And I was like, what is this? And I listened to the audiobook, and it is amazing, at least in my opinion. I think Sean Hamill does a really good job. It's set with sort of like an older Kane, and I think he does a really good job in carrying over that worldview into a very different setting where Kane is negotiating witch trials in England, which is something that you often make that association with Puritans, and so especially if you're dealing with supernatural monster hunter Solomon Kane, you gotta have a witch trial story with him, and so Sean Hamill really utilizes that setting in this story, while at the same time maintaining a lot of the spirit of these original stories. He doesn't write in exactly the same way that Howard does, but he really maintains the heart of these Howard stories. And he plays a lot with this religious worldview that Solomon Kane has, and also confronting supernatural things that he can't explain, or that don't fit into the boxes that he's predisposed to try to organize the world into. And some of the concluding elements to it, I mentioned this in some of my other videos that I've mentioned this in, some of the concluding elements to this story actually remind me of like a Tim Powers novel, which is totally up my alley. So, Suffer the Witch might not be for everyone, but certainly if you're a fan of Solomon Kane, I would recommend you check it out. You don't have to deal with some of the things that people are uncomfortable with or that are dated in the original Solomon Kane stories, some of the depictions of Africa, for example, since it's only set in England. I don't necessarily know that I would say read that before reading the Howard stories. The Howard stories are my favorite still. But if you've read the Howard stories and you're looking for something else, the pastiche novel, I think, is well worth your time. And then the last thing that I'll touch on briefly, because I'm still working my way through it, is the Solomon Kane comics by Marvel. So I have here this, what would this be? An omnibus from Marvel of the Solomon Kane comics, and these have been great so far. There's a combination of black and white, and then also illustrated ones. The art in this is great, which is exactly what you would expect from Marvel Comics. And it's a combination of adaptations of the Howard stories and also original stories. And to be perfectly honest, this is kind of the type of thing that I want when I want a story to be adapted, right? Like, there's so much, there are so many opportunities for things to go wrong when you're making a movie. There's too many cooks in the kitchen, what have you. But to have one person or two people with a single vision executing it, this has been great reading through these comics. Some of them have been really fun. There's even one where, like, Solomon Kane is encountering Dracula. So the authors are clearly having fun with it as well. So, anyway, hopefully I've done a good job describing why I like this character, that historical grounding combined with the mythic, the supernatural elements, the monsters that he's facing down. I really like quite a bit. And I really think that I'm going to be rereading these stories, especially those long ones, I think are really strong. Because there are fewer Solomon Kane stories, Howard also doesn't really get into a rut with them, which you kind of get with the Conan stories, where there's a swath of like 5 or 6 of the Conan stories that are kind of interchangeable, all kind of read the same. They go through similar beats. It's like, oh, we found another lost city, we found another damsel who needs to be rescued, and you don't have that as much in the Solomon Kane stories. He doesn't really have an opportunity to be formulaic. So while at the same time I would love to have more short stories from him, maybe it's for the best. Maybe less is more. And while there are some of the Conan stories, there's a few that are rather long, that are almost novella length. Most of the Conan stories are relatively short, and the best of the Solomon Kane ones are his longer ones that are 50 to 80 pages long. So if you haven't read these, I highly recommend them. This is some of the best reading that I've had all year. I've thoroughly enjoyed them, and Robert E. Howard is probably one of my favorite fantasy authors at this point. So, anyway, guys, thank you so much for watching this. If you want to get in touch with me or talk with me about Solomon Kane or just books in general, as always, I link the Book Street Boys Discord down below, where I and a bunch of other booktubers hang out. Thank you so much for watching this, and I'll see you next time. Take care.